Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Python and JavaScript to create a to-do list website that runs using AJAX requests. Okay, so I have now created a new folder called To Do. I have put it into my Visual Studio Code and also opened it in my terminal. So the first thing that we need to do is create a virtual environment. We'll say Python 3-m venv and we'll give it a name of myenv. Once this has done, we will activate it. So source myenv bin activate. And now that it's active, we are going to use pip install and Flask. Now I'm using pip 3 because obviously I'm using Python 3. So whilst that is working, we'll go over to here and we will create a templates folder and a static folder, but the static folder needs to be in the root. And then we will also create an app.py file, and then in the templates, an index.html, and in the static, a styles.css. So now we have our app.py. Now if we come back to our terminal, make sure everything's sorted, what we'll do is we'll just import Flask. So from Flask, import Flask, render template, request, redirect, and JSONify. Now we'll create a app variable, which will just instantiate the Flask app, and we'll say if __ name is double equal to main, and then app.run, and we will pass in debug true. So now if we first want to create our index file, we'll just say app.root, and we'll say def index, and here we will just return render template index.html, and as a test, we will pass in hello world. So now going back to our terminal, we can say Python 3 app.py. We now have this development server running. So now if we come over to Google Chrome and paste, we now see hello world. Okay, so this is going to be a to-do list app. And while it's best to make sure that everything is stored inside a database, because this is such a lightweight tutorial, I am going to replicate this by having our own tasks.txt file. And the tasks.txt file is literally going to just contain the ID and the task, which is essentially what you'd have. You'd have two columns in the database. The first one would be ID, which would be a primary key, and the second one would be a string, which will hold the task. So first, we're going to create a constant, which is tasks_file, and this will just be tasks.txt. So this will reference this file that we've just created. Now back here, what we can do is just have our index, and we can pass in here tasks, and we will just create a load task function, and then we will pass in tasks and pass in the variable here into this task. So now in the index.html, we will be able to actually reference these tasks. So if we create a HTML5 boilerplate, we'll just say to do. Now in here, if we were to loop through for task in tasks, and we can just output the task. Now currently we don't actually have a load tasks function, so we need to create that. So what we'll say is def load_tasks, and we are going to try to open the tasks file with the readability method, so as file, and then we'll say tasks equal file.readlines, and we are going to return an array which has an object of ID, and then int, and we'll say task.split on a comma. So we're going to split the task on a comma, and we'll pass in 0. We are then going to say task underscore name, and that will be task dot split on a comma, and then we'll pass in the first index, and we are going to strip, so that will remove any white space. And then outside of the object, I think that I have added an extra bracket. Yes, I have. So that needs to be like that. Okay, so then that can go. And then at the outside of this, we can say for task in tasks. So this is going to essentially create an inline for loop where we are looping through this task. We're splitting the line into essentially an ID and a task name. So what we'll have is essentially in here, we'll say 1, test task. So then 1 will be the ID and the task name will be test task. So we'll leave that there because hopefully, if all is going well, when we have created our accept and file not found, we can just return an empty array or an empty list. So now if we come back to here, when we refresh, we get an error. Load task is not right, I missed an S. Load tasks. Okay, so we now get outputted ID 1, task name, test task. So it's pulling in the data correctly, which is perfect. Okay, so now that we have it outputting correctly, we want to create a way to add, remove, and clear. So this is CRUD functionality. So first we will create our way to add. So we'll say app.root, and we'll pass in just the add, and this will be a method of post. Say def add, so this is just an add function, and we are going to say task equal request.form. And we'll say task, so this requires us to have a form that has a name of task. Say tasks is equal to load tasks, and this then means that we are just retrieving the tasks. And we'll say task ID is equal to add task, tasks, and the task. So we need to now create a function that adds the task to the list of tasks that we have. But before we do this, we just want to return JSONify ID with task ID. So now up here, if we create a new function called add task, we'll pass in tasks and the task name. So here we will say task ID is equal to the length of tasks plus 1, and we'll say tasks.append ID is equal to task ID, and task name is equal to task underscore name. And then we need to save the task in the file. So we'll say save tasks and then tasks and return the task ID. So now we need to create a new function for saving the tasks. So def save tasks, And we obviously need to pass in the list of tasks because we need to make sure that this is being saved, or this new entry that we've just added to this tasks is being saved. So save tasks, we'll say with open tasks file, and we want this as write, so we can actually write. We'll say as file, and we'll say for task in tasks, and then file.write, and we'll use an F string to just say task ID, comma, task name. And then outside of this, but still inside of the line, we will put a new line break. So this will just make sure that everything is on a new line. Okay, so now we have this. We kind of need a way to actually add the task to our database. So if we come back to our index.html, we can remove this. What we'll do now is we'll just create a container for everything. And then inside of this, we'll just create a to-do list heading 1 and a form with the ID of add task form. Now, we don't need an action because we're going to be handling the action using jQuery. And we'll say input type of text, we'll say the ID task input, and we'll say placeholder enter a new task, and we'll make this required. And then we'll say input type submit with the value of add. So now if we come back to here and refresh, we have a form. And we probably still want to make sure that we are outputting things correctly. So what we'll do is we'll just create a UL that has an ID of task list. And then here we will have for task in tasks, N4, and we will use an li to just output the task. So now if we come back to here and refresh, we have our task being outputted correctly. However, what we actually really want is just the task name. So if we come back to here, we can pass in task name and refresh, and we have just test task. Okay, so we probably need to add in the functionality for the AJAX request to handle this form. So if we come down to here, we will add in a script with a source of the code.jquery.com. This will allow us to use the jQuery minified JavaScript library. And then we'll just console log the window just to make sure that everything is working. So if we inspect console, we have the window object, perfect. So now heading back to here, if we now create a document ready function, now inside this document ready, we want to be able to handle the add task. So we'll say add task form dot submit. We'll create a function that passes in the actual event. And then here we are going to say event dot prevent default. So this will stop the form being submitted. And we are going to get the task input, and we will assign that to the ID of task input, and then we'll get the value. And then we now need to create a post request. So this will be an AJAX post request. So we will pass in add. So this is going to essentially replicate the root of add, and we are going to pass in task input, and then function of data. So this is going to be what is returned to us, and then we can append the data as we need to. So what we'll do is we will just create a task list, or we'll use the task list, sorry, and we'll append a new li. So this will essentially be outputting a new task in there when it's been added. And here we shall create the task input. So we'll use an li span. So we'll actually create a span for in here as well. And then we'll say task input, and then we will close the li and the span, and we will then change the task input back to an empty string. So now, if all goes well, I should be able to add a new task, and it should be outputted here, and it should also be saved to our file. So we have a new test there. If we come back to here, tasks, perfect. So we see 2 and test. So that is all working as expected. So now we need a way to remove the specific task that we are working with. So what we need to do is go back to the app.py, and if down here we create a new root, and we are going to say remove, and now we want to make sure that it's just this specific task that's being removed. So we'll pass in the task ID as an integer, which means that if you go to remove /2, then that number 2 shall be removed, and it will leave number 1 intact. So now here we need to pass in a post request because we are still posting, and we'll say def remove, and we'll pass in task ID. And here we're going to take a variable of task, and we will say load tasks. So this will get all of the tasks. We'll say essentially if task ID is greater than 0, but it's less than or equal to the length of tasks, then we're going to say tasks is equal to task for task in tasks, and then we'll say if the task ID is not equal to the task ID. So what this is doing is we're looping through all of the tasks that's been passed here, and we're checking that the task ID is not equal to the task ID. And if that's right, then we are assigning that to tasks. Now we can then say save tasks, because we're passing in the list, because this will still output a list. So we are essentially removing the task ID, or the entry in here that matches the task ID. And then we can say removed task with ID task_ID, and we will return a redirect to the home page. Okay, so now we have everything put in correctly. We now need to make sure that we are retrieving the task ID correctly. So if we come to here, inside of this, we will create a button that will output, or that will hold the task ID in a data attribute. So what we'll do is we'll say button, class is equal to remove task button. We'll say data-task ID is equal to task ID, and then we'll just say remove. So now if we come back to Google Chrome and refresh, we have two new buttons, but if we inspect, this one will say task ID number 1, and this one will say task ID 2. So we have a way now to differentiate between them. But now we need to create a way to actually remove the task from the list and handle the routing. So we'll say document.onClick. Now we need to use a binding method because this button will be dynamically created some of the time. Like it's there now because we refresh, but if we add a new task, we need a button to be dynamically created. So we need to use a binding method. And to do that, we'll pass in another parameter, which will be the class. So remove task button, and then we will use a function. Okay, so now let's just create a way of handling this button. So what we can do now is outside of the span here, we can pass in button, say class remove task button, and we'll say data-task is equal to, and then inside of this, we will say data.id. So this is the ID of the data that's being passed back when we create a new task. And then we will say, I think it needs pluses either side to concatenate correctly. And I'm just going to Alt-Z just to make sure that everything wraps. So now that we have the data task, we can then add a label to the button. So now we should have a button. And to make sure that this button actually works with the binding, let's just console log a click. So now if I head back to here and go to my console and I refresh just to make sure that everything is up to date, if I add a third test, we get this button, which is perfect, should have an ID of data task 3, perfect. Now if I click remove, perfect. So we have click being console logged on a button that hasn't actually been created yet. So now if we come back to Visual Studio Code, we can remove this, and then we need to handle the actual AJAX call. So we'd say task ID is equal to this, so the button that was clicked, dot data, and we'll pass in task ID, as that will emulate the data-task ID, which is a good spot because that wouldn't have worked. So make sure that this task ID or this data attribute says data-task ID, because then that will correlate to this correctly. Now we can use a post request, and we will say remove / and then here we will add the task ID, and we're just going to create a function that will pass back the data. So now inside of this request, we can say li.each, and we will create a function. And this is just going to loop through all the LIs, and then we'll say if this dot find, and we're going to find the remove task button, and then we'll say dot data task ID is double equal to task ID. Then we are going to remove this using jQuery. So that will just remove it from the front end, but then this remove function here will remove it from the back end as well. So now if we come back to Google Chrome and we refresh, we should see the third test. If I click this, it removes from the front end, but also we come to here and we don't see a third input, which is perfect. Everything is working as expected. but now we need a way to clear all the tasks just in case everything is getting a bit too hectic. So what we'll do is at the bottom, we will create a new root, and this will be /clear. It will be a post method, and we will just create a clear function, and this will just clear tasks and then return redirect of /. So now we need to create a clear tasks, and this, because we are just working with a file, is essentially going to open the file and write the file, but it will make it an empty file. So we'll say def clear tasks, and we'll say with open tasks file, we'll pass it as writable. And here we are just going to say file.write, and that will be it. So now we have this function which calls clear tasks, which opens this file and writes it completely brand new. So now if we come back onto here, at the bottom of our list, so outside of the UL, we'll create a new button. We'll give it an ID of clear tasks button. We'll just say remove all tasks. So now down here, if we create a event listener for that, so clear tasks button, and we'll say .click. This will create a event listener for every time that button has been clicked. And we're just gonna say $.post to the URL of clear, and we'll create a function. And then inside of this function, we are just going to remove them all from the front end. So task list.empty. Okay, so now if we come back onto here and refresh, we have a remove all tasks button. If I click that, it's all gone from the front end. If we go back to here and we check our task.txt, it is now empty. So we have a working to-do list. We just now need to style it to make it look a little bit more appealing to the eye. So if we come back to our styles.css, say body, and we'll say font family of Arial, and then we'll say background color F7, 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 margin 0, padding 0. We'll give the container a max width of 600 pixels, margin of 20 pixels to the top and the bottom, and then auto left and right, which will centralize it. Padding of 20 pixels, background color of white. Give it a border radius of 8 pixels, and then a box shadow of 0 pixels, 2 pixels, 5 pixels, with an RGBA of 0 and then 0.1 opacity. We'll give the heading one centralized alignment, and we'll give a margin bottom of 20 pixels. So now if we come back to here and refresh, nothing happens, and I think it's because I forgot to link the style sheet. So if we link, we need to go to static, so URL for static, and then file name is equal to styles.css. So now it is working as expected. So we now have a centralized container with a central piece of text. We just now need to start styling the rest. So if we use the input, we'll say input type of text. So this will target only inputs that are text, we'll actually style the form first. So we'll give that a display of flex. We'll give it a margin bottom of 20 pixels. And we'll give it a gap of 1 rem. So that will give 1 rem gap in between all the elements inside of it. So now with the input type text, we'll say flex 1. We have padding of 10 pixels, font size of 16 pixels, border of 1 pixel solid CCC, and then a border radius of 4 pixels. And now we can style the input submit. And here we'll say padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels, font size of 16, background color of 4CA F50, color of white, border none, border radius of 4 pixels, and then cursor pointer. So now if we refresh, we have a lot more styling added. It actually has some kind of formatting to it. Now we will handle the list elements. So first we'll say list style type, and we'll say none, and we'll give it a padding of 0. That just resets the ULs to have no inbuilt formatting from the browsers. And then we'll say list items, display flex, align items center, justify content space between, give a padding of 10 pixels, and then a border bottom of 1 pixel solid EE, which will be another grey. But then we will make sure that the last child doesn't have a border bottom. So border bottom none. And then we are going to target the clear all button. So we'll say button, and this is because it's the only button that we have now, because the button earlier is actually an input with type submit. So we'll say button, background color, F44336, and then we'll say color of green, color of white, and then border none, border radius of 4 pixels, padding 6 pixels, 12 pixels, font size of 14 pixels, we'll say cursor pointer, and then we will give the button a hover state. So we'll change the background color to be D32F2F. So it's just a bit of a darker red. So now if we refresh, we have a nice little hover state. If we then create a test and we add it, we then have another button here, and then we will say new test, and we'll add, and we have a border between them, test 3. And now if we go back onto here and just double check that everything's working correctly, we have a working to-do list that saves to our own text file. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use AJAX to create a one-page website that is interactive and allows Python and JavaScript to communicate together. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.